In the last video, we discussed switch statements and ternary operator, which allowed us to make decisions in our program. Today, we will see how we can create functions. So far in this course, we've used a lot of functions, pre-built functions to be exact. Like for example, the size of function, which takes one parameter, which should be a data type or a variable. For example, int x, for example, it will take a data type or a variable and it will return for us what is the size of this data. So an integer variable is of size 4 bytes, for example. So this is a pre-built function. But how can we create our own function that will do whatever we want it to do? So first of all, what are functions? Functions, if you want, are simply block of code, or they contain block of code that can be reused multiple times, because you can call the function multiple times, which makes it reusable or makes the code inside of it reusable. It is good for maintaining your code and making sure that everything is clean and to avoid redundancy. So let's see how we can create a function. So to create a function, you always need to have a return type. What is a return type? A return type is what the function should return. So maybe the function needs to return an integer, or it should return nothing. We will see what means nothing. In programming, it means void, but we will see it later. Next, you need to name the function. So you give it a name. Then you need to make sure that it has parentheses, or it won't be a function anymore. And inside those parentheses, you have the option to add some parameters or not to add parameters, because it is optional in the end. So let us see how we can create a function. So if I want to create a function that simply says hello to the user, or hello world for example, that means this function shouldn't return anything. It just prints hello world. So what to do here? First of all, I need to define the return type of a function. If a function doesn't return anything, its return type will be void. Void means nothing. The function doesn't return anything. Now what the name of the function will be? Let's say it will be greet, for example. And as you can see, I put parentheses because it is a function. Now I will put semicolon. And this right here is called a function prototype. So function prototype. Let me write it correctly. So like this. So what is a function prototype? It is a function that doesn't have any implementation. Implementation means block of code, okay? So if a function doesn't have implementation, it is called a prototype function, okay? So why it is above the main and why did we wrote it like this, I'll explain this later. But this is right now a function prototype. Now to give it implementation, what I will do is simply I will copy the name of the function and go down the main or after the main. So after the main, I can offer the function its implementation. But this time I won't write semicolon. I will open and close curly brackets. Inside, I will be offering this function its implementation. For example, I could write cout hello world and hello world. Now you can do whatever you do in the main, like you can create here variables, you can use if statements, and just like the main, you can do whatever you want inside your own function, inside your custom function, okay? We have a function, we created a function, but how can we use this function? So we need to go to the main because it is the main function of our code, it is the starting point of our code, so here everything will be run from the main. So to call this function, we need to call it, of course, but how? By mentioning its name. So greet like this. So when you invoke or call the function, it will be executed. So the block of code inside your function will be executed. Also, there is no limitation of how many times you can call a function. For example, first of all, let me add here endl for a new line. And let me go ahead, copy this function and paste it 4 times. There is no limit to how much I can call this function. And now let me go ahead and see what this function will give us. So hello world 4 times because I called the function 4 times. So in order to use a function, you need to call it or invoke it by writing its name. Now, why did we wrote a function prototype right here, which is above the main, and after the main, we gave it implementation? So let me tell you something. When you run your code, first of all, the compiler will always search for the main function. And so it will start from here all the way to the main function. If I didn't have the function prototype right here, let me take it off. As you can see, we should get some errors. If I go ahead and compile first of all my code, I get an error. It says that greet is not declared in the scope. That means the compiler first of all didn't recognize the greet function. That's because it started from up here, it goes to the main, and it sees that you actually called a function called greet. and the compiler never saw in your code that you have a function called greet. That is why it is better to have a function prototype here and an implementation right after the main function. Now, of course, you could actually create the implementation of the function also above the main. So you could, by not create a function prototype, you could just create the function like this and give it the implementation like this. Now this works properly, of course, but why it is better to have a function prototype? Well, it's better because it keeps your code clean. It lets you have all your function prototypes above the main, and right after the main you have the implementation of your functions. It is just to keep your code clean, okay? But now you know how to create a function in two ways. Either you create a function prototype and then the implementation under the main, or you just simply create the function right here as you saw earlier, like this, and you put whatever implementation you want inside of it. Now let's talk about parameters. What if I want my function to have a parameter? Let's say the greet function right here. I want first of all to take input from the user, which will be their name, and I want to say hello name, or hello the name of the user. So let us first of all create a variable called string that will store the name of the user. And now I will be including a header file called string because I want to be using the getLine function, the built-in getLine function that comes from the header file called string. Okay, and if you want to check out how to get input from the user, make sure to check out this video where I explain how to get input from CN and getLine. So I'll say here getLine. Oh, first of all, let me just print a simple message like input name, like this, input name. And right here I could call getLine, so I'll say getLine. And as you can see here, I'm calling or invoking the getLine function, and because it is a function that needs parameters, I need to offer it parameters. It takes two parameters first of all. The first one should be a cin or an iStream object, and then it should be the variable that will store the name of the user, which will be our variable called name. Okay, and now let's see, and now first of all, let us make our function right here take some parameters. So in order for a function to take parameters, you need to define what is the parameter. So let's say it will be a string user name. And now because your function prototype has a parameter, you need to go down here and offer the parameter for this function right here in order to be using it in your implementation. So I could go ahead and say, instead of hello world, I could delete this and say something like hello username. Very simple. It's just like a variable. So a parameter is simply a variable, a local variable that belongs to the function that you created in. So because this variable, or excuse me, the parameter is created within the greet function, it can be only used inside the greet function. You cannot call it inside the main. Okay, you can only use it inside the greet function. And just like any other variables, you can do whatever you want with it. And so you can use it inside your function like what we did right here. So what are parameters? Parameters are simply input for the function, and your function will be working with this input. And as you can see here, we are getting errors because this function greet right now takes a parameter. So we should offer it a parameter. So I will say name right here, which will be the variable that will store the name of the user. Now here's some terminology. This right here is called a parameter, okay? But this right here is called an argument for the function. So a parameter is simply this parameter right here, which is within the function, and an argument is the input given for a function. Okay, so this is just some terminology, but let's go ahead and launch our code and see if it works. So I will go ahead and launch it. So get name or input name. So I'll say John Smith, for example. As you can see, hello John Smith. So the get line received our input and it's stored inside the string variable. And so we invoke the function, giving it the string variable or giving it an argument. So it receives this argument and says cout hello username, which will be John Smith. So this is how you can give a function arguments. Okay, here's what we're going to do right now. First of all, we'll define a function called sum. It will have two variables and the return type should be an integer. So let's start with this one and then we'll do the average. So first of all, create the function prototype. How to do this? Well, first of all, we start with the return type. It says here that the return type should be an integer. So I'll simply write here int, and this is the return type. Next, the function name, which should be sum, and the parameters. So we have parameter 1, which is num1, it should be an integer. So int num1 and int num2 for the parameter number 2. Okay, so this is the function prototype of the sum function. Okay, now let's go ahead and create the implementation. So the implementation comes after the main, I will go ahead and paste it right here, and now let's give it a implementation. So basically we need to add num1 and num2 together. Let's do this. So I'll create a variable called result, and I will say num1 plus num2. Simple. But there's a problem. The sum function should return something, should return a integer. It says right here return type of integer. That means it should return an integer. So how to return something? Well, simply we could use the return keyword right here. So return and say what we need to return. So I need to return the result of the sum between num1 and num2. Okay? And so instead of creating a variable right here, I could go ahead and say it quickly like this. So I could say return num1 plus num2. So what will happen? It will add num1 and num2 and then return the sum of num1 plus num2. So what does the return keyword do? It simply returns something for the user. So when you call this function and this function returns something, that means it returns a data type. And also what comes after the return keyword that won't be executed. Why? Because the return keyword has another specialty. When you write return, what it will do is it will return whatever the function needs to return, and then it will terminate the function. So whatever code is written below the return keyword won't be executed, because the flow of the program will simply exit out of the function and will continue from the main. So this is just something to know, that the return keyword returns a data type as well as exit completely from the function. And now let's go ahead and try this function. So I'll say something like int num1 equal to 12, for example, int num2 equal to 13. I will say something like, well, because the sum variable, or excuse me, the sum function returns something, it is logical to create a function or a variable called result. And what I could do is call the sum variable and of course give it parameters like num1 and num2, and whatever this sum variable returns, it will be stored inside this variable, making sure that whatever is returned by the sum variable is compatible with this data type. So if it returns an integer, we need to put it inside an integer variable. Now, let's go ahead and try it. So I'll say cout something like result. So I'll say result right here. Let's go ahead and try this. So I'll compile first of all, and then I'll execute, and as you can see, 25. So this code pretty much works good. Now let's go to this function. So this function is called average. It takes a sum parameter of type integer, and it returns a double. So let's go ahead, write the function prototype. So the return type is double. I'll say avj for average, and I'll say something like int sum. This is the parameter. Now let's go down here and create the implementation. So I'll copy this first of all, and right now I'll go down here and create the implementation. So the implementation, we should first of all open curly brackets, and because we are accepting only two parameters, well, it will be logical if we want to find the average of two numbers, we need to divide the sum by two numbers, because we are having two numbers. So this is how you find the average. And now for the implementation, we will simply say return, and what we'll do, we'll say sum divided by 2. And so this is the average function. Let's go ahead and try this. So if I say something like double equal to average, so this is the variable, so average equal to avj, and pass it, for example, the result variable, this right here will find as the average. So let me delete this and say average. Like this, we will see the average of those two numbers. And how about we go ahead, compile, then let us launch. We got 12. Now the reason we got 12 is that because we're passing first of all an integer variable. So when you pass an integer variable and you divide an integer variable by 2 or by an integer, you will get a result of an integer. Okay, so you won't get a result of a double. And if you got a result of an integer, that means you won't get a number point something. You will get a whole number, like 12. So how could we transform this integer to a double? So what you can do is use static cast. And static cast, we saw this in some video or in some tutorial I did, and it simply means that you are converting a integer variable to a double. So inside those signs, I could say double, and this means that I want to cast the sum parameter or variable right here to a double. Okay, now this will allow us simply to gain an output that is a double. So if I go ahead, compile, and then launch, as you can see, this time we got 12.5 because you divided a double by an integer, and so the output will be a double. Now let me delete all of this and let's talk about function overloading. So let's see what means function overloading. First of all, let's go ahead and create a int add variable, or excuse me, add function that will take num1 and num2 as parameters. And let me go ahead and do the implementation right here, okay? What this does is it simply returns num1 plus num2. So it adds two numbers, right? And returns an integer. And if I go right here and say something like int num1 equal to 12, int num2 equal to 13. And now what I will do is say something like cout add and pass num1 and num2 as argument for the respective parameters right here. Okay? And so like this, I'm just simply adding two numbers using the add function. Now what if I want to add three numbers? What if I had int num3 right here equal to 14? So let me go ahead and copy this and paste it right here. Could I say something like int num1 and num2 and num3 also? Could I pass a third argument? Well, no, I can't. Why? Because this function right here only takes two arguments and I'm giving it three arguments. Okay, so it says the error, too many arguments for the function. So what should we do in this case? Well, we could use function overloading. Overloading means simply you're giving something more work. So you're giving the function more work to do. To overload a function, you simply need to rewrite the function, but either with different return type or with different parameters or number of parameters. So it should have the same name of this function. So I'll say something like add, but it should have a different return type. But I don't want it to have a different return type, so I'll say int. But I want it to have different number of parameters. So I'll say something like num1 and num2 like this, and num3. And what you did right now is you overloaded the add function. And so if I go ahead and say something like return num1 plus num2 plus num3, this works properly. And as you can see, there is no more errors right here. But why exactly? How does this work? So let's go ahead and first of all launch this code to see if it will work properly. As you can see, it works properly. But how does it work? How does the compiler is able to distinguish between which add function it should use? So let's go ahead and see here. This add function only takes two parameters. So the compiler will look at those functions and see which version of the add function takes two parameters. So this is the version of the function called add that takes two parameters. So it will use this version to be able to solve this problem. Okay? But here it sees that the add function takes three parameters. So this function won't work. That's why it will go to this function which takes three parameters, and this function will be used to solve this problem. So this is function overloading. So you can go ahead and say something like double add, and it could add double num1 and double num2. Like this, you overloaded the add function, and I could say something like return num1 and plus num2. So right now if I go ahead right here and say something like, so instead of num1 and num2, I could say 2.4, 2.5, and now this works properly also. So let's go ahead and first of all compile. As you can see, our code works properly. That's because we overloaded the add function. The compiler will look at it and see what are the number of parameters. Okay, there's two parameters. This function has two parameters. Then it will look at the type of these parameters. What are the type of these parameters? So both of them are double. That means this function will definitely not work because it takes two integers, so it will definitely be this function. So the compiler will use this function to solve this problem. And this is the end of today's lesson. And this is how you can create your own function in C++. Now make sure to subscribe to stay up to date for the next lesson, which we will talk about the pass by reference and pass by value parameters in functions. Thank you for watching this video. Make sure to click on one of these end screens that will appear right now, and I hope to see you in the next video.